A lot of this that we're going to go over today should be somewhat familiar because we did go through all the major brain regions in lab, not last week, but the week before, before Thanksgiving break. So we're going to do a little bit different order this time. I'm going to follow the same order as our textbook. So we're going to start out with the lowest brain center, which is the medulla oblongata, and then we're going to work our way up to the cerebrum. Okay? So the lowest brain region is the medulla oblongata. That's the lowest portion of what's called the brain stem. The brain stem is the part of the brain from the medulla oblongata all the way up to the top of the diencephalon. Okay? So what's that upper part of the diencephalon called? What's the roof of the diencephalon? Okay, did I hear somebody down here say? Well, what's above the thalamus? There's a very thin sliver of tissue just above the thalamus. You didn't know this for the quiz this week, the lab quiz, by the way. So a lot of this is going to overlap between lecture and lab because we're going over some of the same brain regions in lab on the quiz this week in lab. Okay. Part above the thalamus is the what thalamus? Epithalamus. Epithalamus. Okay. The tissue below the thalamus is the hypothalamus, and then the thalami, the two parts of the thalamus, that's the third part of the diencephalon. So that's the highest part of the brainstem. The rest is the cerebrum. Okay. So the medulla oblongata has several different brain centers that you can't distinguish visually. They just look like all the rest of the brain tissue in the brainstem that control major autonomic functions. And so in the medulla oblongata, there's a cardiac center that regulates the heart. There's a respiratory center that sends out the basic sends out the signals that produce the basic pattern of breathing. The inspiratory stage followed by the expiratory stage. And then there's also a vasomotor center, which is very closely tied to the cardiac center. The vasomotor center regulates blood pressure. It does that by controlling the diameter of the blood vessels in the body. And then also there's a vomiting center. There's a reflex center for the vomiting reflex. Vomiting is actually a reflex. It's an involuntary reflex, and it's integrated in the vomiting center located in the medulla oblongata. Then the next level of the brain is called the metencephalon because it develops from the metencephalon region of the 5-week-old human embryo. And there are two parts to develop from the metencephalon, the cerebellum and the pons. And the metencephalon, it contains a lot of ascending and descending nerve tracts that consist of myelinated axons that carry signals up and down the brainstem. And the pons also contains an important respiratory center. It's called the pontine respiratory group. Now, it used to be that physiologists thought there was actually two respiratory centers in the pons. One of them they called the pneumotaxic center, which could speed up the respiratory rate. And there was another one called the apneustic center, which could slow down the respiratory rate. But that was based on studies of laboratory animals. It wasn't based on studies of humans. So since then, they've made the discovery that humans are different than laboratory animals. And so you have to study humans directly to understand structure and function of humans. so now they think that there's just one center in the pons, called the pontine respiratory group, that can either speed up or slow down the respiratory rate. So it's the medulla oblongata that sends out a burst of action potentials that causes inspiration, and then when that burst of action potential stops, then expiration occurs. So that produces the basic pattern of breathing. But it's the pontine respiratory group that determines the rate of that basic pattern. So the pontine respiratory group can cut that burst of inspiratory signals shorter, which will speed up the respiratory rate, or it can prolong that burst of action potentials, which can slow down the respiratory rate. In addition, the pons also gives rise to some of the cranial nerves. Not important that you need to know which ones, but you know, when we looked at sheep brains, you could see one large cranial nerve. Well, you can actually see this on the brain models too. There was one large cranial nerve that came right out of the middle of the pons, and that was the trigeminal nerve. But it also gives rise to cranial nerves 6 through 8 as well. Then the other part that develops from the metencephalon, so it's about the same level as the pons, is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum shares a lot of characteristics with the cerebrum, which is kind of the reason why it has a similar name. For example, there's a thin layer of gray matter on the outside of the cerebellum called the cerebellar cortex, just like the cerebrum has gray matter on the outside called the cerebral cortex. And there's white matter deeper in the cerebellum, just like there's a lot of white matter deep in the cerebrum. In addition, if you look on the posterior part of the two cerebellar hemispheres, you'll see a median structure that sort of looks like an earthworm. And anatomists gave this the name vermis, which means worm. And so this middle part of the cerebellum is called the vermis, and then you have the right and left cerebellar hemispheres. So there's two cerebellar hemispheres, just like there's two hemispheres of the cerebrum. Now, the cerebellum, as it turns out, actually integrates a number of important functions. One of the primary functions, which was the first one to be discovered, was the coordination of voluntary motor control. So it monitors muscle contractions, and if the actual contractions are different from what was intended, then the cerebellum will send out signals that modify those descending motor impulses in order to smooth out motor control. So it helps to improve motor coordination. But since that was first discovered, there have been a lot of other functions of the cerebellum. One of them is evaluation of sensory input, such as comparing textures of objects without looking at them, in other words, just by touch. And it's also involved in spatial perception and comprehension of different views of a three-dimensional object, like being able to recognize that a side of a three-dimensional object is part of that object itself. There's also a timekeeping center that's involved in prediction of the movement of objects. There's actually a part of the cerebellum, surprisingly, that's involved in hearing. There's a center that allows us to distinguish between different pitches of sound and similar sounding words. And it's also involved in planning and scheduling tasks. And lesions of the cerebellum may result in an inability to control one's emotions. It may cause problems with things like impulse control and the ability to control one's emotions. Then the next highest level of the brain is the midbrain, which is one of the simpler regions. The midbrain is made up of mostly white matter. The midbrain is this area right here, over here. The midbrain is this region right in here. It has a narrow canal going through the middle of it. That's called the mesencephalic aqueduct. And on the posterior side of the midbrain, there are 4 bumps. You can see from a posterior view of the midbrain. Those 4 bumps are part of what's called the tectum, and those 4 bumps are called the corpora quadrigemina. The corpora quadrigemina, as we learned in lab 2 weeks ago, is made up of 2 parts. The top 2 bumps are called the superior colliculi, which functions as a center for visual reflexes. And the bottom 2 bumps are called the inferior colliculi, and that's a center for auditory reflexes. So, vision and hearing are both interpreted by the cerebrum, but visual and auditory reflexes are integrated in the midbrain, in the superior and inferior colliculi, respectively. Then the next highest center, is the diencephalon. As I said 2 weeks ago, the diencephalon is made up of 3 parts. The roof of the diencephalon is called the epithalamus, and that terminates posteriorly as a pineal gland, which secretes the hormone melatonin, which is involved in the regulation of sleep. Then the lateral walls right here, over here, right here, this portion is called the thalamus. Thalamus is a major relay center for all sensory pathways except for olfaction. The olfactory pathways go straight up through the cribriform plate, and then they synapse on the olfactory bulbs. All other senses, like the sense of vision, sense of hearing, sense of taste, all the cutaneous sensations, those pathways go up to the thalamus, where those neurons synapse with higher order neurons that carry the signals up to the part of the cerebrum that interprets those senses. So there's different pathways that go to different regions. What determines the sense that we perceive is not what sensory receptors stimulated, but it's actually what part of the brain receives that signal. So if you just stimulate the part of the brain that is responsible for interpreting vision, the person will actually perceive that they see something. Okay? Because it's the brain. You don't see with your eyes, you don't hear with your ears, you see and you hear with your brain. Because unless the brain receives those signals and interprets them, you will not perceive any stimulus. Okay? So you do have to have the proper sensory receptor stimulated, but unless those signals are received and interpreted by the brain, you'll have no recognition of that stimulus. Then the third part of the diencephalon is the hypothalamus, which is down here, this area. The hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland by a narrow stalk. The stalk right here between the hypothalamus and the pituitary is called the infundibulum. and that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary. And infundibulum is important because the secretions of the pituitary gland are actually controlled by signals from the hypothalamus. And that infundibulum provides a pathway for those signals so that the hypothalamus can control the pituitary gland. And then also part of the diencephalon is the third ventricle. The third ventricle is a hollow space that's very narrow. It's a narrow space located between the two halves of the thalamus. And so this whole area here surrounding the thalamus is filled with fluid, and that space is called the third ventricle. And there's actually a little mass of blood vessels. It's not shown on this diagram, but right below the epithalamus, there's a little mass of blood vessels that secretes the cerebral spinal fluid into the third ventricle. Those blood vessels are called the choroid plexus, and that secretes most of the cerebral spinal fluid into the third ventricle. The cells that line the ventricles, which are called ependymal cells, those also secrete a small amount of cerebral spinal fluid, but most of it is secreted by the choroid plexuses, which are actually located in each of the ventricles. And then we went through this the last time we met 2 weeks ago. From the third ventricle, the fluid then goes through the mesencephalic aqueduct, which passes through the midbrain, then down into the fourth ventricle, and then from there it goes through a small hole, and then it goes into the subarachnoid space, which surrounds the brain. And so that fluid helps to carry away waste produced by the brain, and it also helps to protect the brain by surrounding it. It acts kind of like as a cushion. All right, so the thalamus, which is shown here in blue on this slide, consists of two oval masses at the superior end of the brainstem, and they do protrude medially into the third ventricle. And in about 70% of humans, the two halves of the thalamus are actually fused right at the midline in an area called the intermediate mass. And so when you make a mid-sagittal section through a human brain, sometimes you have to cut through that intermediate mass. And you may be able to see that where you had to cut through it. 30% of people, though, you can cut right in between those two halves without cutting through any part of the thalamus. Okay, any questions about the diencephalon? So the thalamus is sometimes called the gateway to the cerebrum because it's a major relay center for nearly all sensory signals except for olfaction. So that includes sense of taste, the sense of hearing, equilibrium or balance, vision, and all the general senses like the sense of touch, sense of pressure, sense of temperature. All those pathways synapse in the thalamus, and then from there, there's a higher order neuron that carries the signals up to the cerebrum. So the highest part of the diencephalon is the epithalamus. The pineal body or pineal gland is part of the epithalamus. This very long sliver of tissue is called the stria medullaris, and then there's a nucleus or a cluster of neurons located right between the stria medullaris and the pineal gland. It's called the habenula, and The habenula is a nucleus that's a relay from the limbic system to the midbrain. And some studies suggest that that's involved in reward processing, particularly with regard to negative rewards. The pineal body is responsible for secretion of melatonin. Some people take melatonin supplements to help them sleep because that hormone is involved in wakeful cycles. Sometimes if you take that for too long, though, it can disrupt your sleep-wake cycles. So it's probably not a good thing to take that long term. It may prevent you from sleeping if you don't take that anymore. Okay, then the hypothalamus is a fairly large area of tissue inferior to the thalamus, and so this shows some of the different nuclei. And in this sense, a nucleus of the hypothalamus refers to a cluster of neurons. So there's a lot of different clusters of neurons in the hypothalamus, and they have a large number of different autonomic functions. Excuse me, I'm about ready to sneeze here. I'll try to turn away so I don't sneeze on anybody. So, for example, you don't need to know all of these centers. I've mentioned some of them before. There's a thirst center that monitors the osmolarity of your body fluids. If the osmolarity gets too high, it makes you thirsty. So you drink water, which dilutes those fluids, makes the osmolarity lower. There's also a hunger center that controls hunger. It makes you want to eat when your blood sugar gets too low. There are a couple of different centers that are involved in sleep-wake cycles. There's one of them, this red area right here that's right next to the optic chiasm, which is probably no coincidence because the suprachiasmatic nucleus, this red area, that monitors those signals that are traveling through those pathways from the optic nerves. And that allows the brain to be aware of whether or not it's light out and that you should be awake, or whether it's dark and that you should be sleeping. So that helps to synchronize the sleep-wake cycles. There's also another area, the preoptic nucleus, that's involved in hormonal control of reproductive functions. There's a whole bunch of different autonomic centers. Those autonomic centers are involved in regulation of functions that maintains your body's homeostasis, meets your bodily needs. All right, let's see what's going on here. I might have got disconnected here from. I don't know why I have problems. I have more problems in this room than I do in any of the other classrooms. Okay, here we go. Now it's working. All right. Just kind of slow reacting, I guess. Okay. So let's do a review question. This question asks, which of the following is the most superior? We're getting close to the end of the semester, so I thought the code Fried Brains was appropriate. I don't know about you, but I'm starting to feel stressed out because I have lots of things I need to do today. I have to help a student who's doing a capstone presentation on Wednesday, and I haven't had her practice doing it yet. He's not in front of me. Okay, I think everybody should have answered. Make sure you put your username in before you answer these questions so I know you're here. Okay, this question was, which of the following is the most superior? And diencephalon is correct. That's the most superior one that we've talked about today. We still have one region left to go though, and that is the cerebrum. Okay? All right. So, this is a frontal section through the cerebrum. Okay? And in this frontal section, you can see some parts of the lateral ventricles. Lateral ventricles are two ventricles that are found on either side of the midline inside the cerebrum. And they're sort of shaped like a pair of ram's horns. But in just one section, you can only see a small part of that. And so right here and here, you can see just a small part of that. But it's actually, like I said, it's sort of shaped like a pair of like bighorn sheep horns. And you can't see the whole length of it in one single section. So in the roof of these lateral ventricles, there's another pair of blood vessels that secretes cerebrospinal fluid, and that circulates throughout all the ventricles and then surrounding the brain. In addition, you can see that there's a thin layer of gray matter on the outside of the cerebrum. That's called the cerebral cortex. That's where most of the neurons are located. It's packed in that cerebral cortex. These deeper areas are made up of myelinated axons and neuroglial cells. This is called the white matter. White matter mostly just consists of myelinated axons that carry signals from one part of the cerebrum to another, especially between association areas, so you can associate different senses. In addition, very deep in the cerebrum, there's some clusters of gray matter. Those are called the basal ganglia, and they have various functions. Some of them are involved in planning of complex motor activities, putting together complex motor programs. Also in this frontal section, you can see one of the harder to see lobes of the brain. Remember, on the outside of the brain, there's a pair of frontal lobes, there's a pair of parietal lobes, a pair of occipital lobes, and a pair of temporal lobes. And right here you can see right here one of the insula. That's an internal lobe of the brain, and it was formed by an invagination of the cerebral cortex. Whoop. So here you can see the different external lobes plus the internal lobe because they've retracted part of the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe. So the blue shaded area is the frontal lobe. That includes this dark blue area, which is the precentral gyrus, which is the primary motor cortex. And then this purple shaded area is the parietal lobe, and that includes the postcentral gyrus, which is the primary somatosensory cortex. And then on the posterior side of the cerebrum, you have the occipital lobes. That's where the primary visual area is located, on the posterior part of the occipital lobes. Primary visual area is the part of the brain that interprets visual signals from the eyes. And then on the lateral side, you have externally, you have the temporal lobe, and internally, you have the insula. Okay, so those are the five pairs of lobes. And then another, one of the functional parts of the cerebrum is the limbic system. And the limbic system actually extends over more than one of the lobes. And it spans several different anatomical divisions. You can't really distinguish it visually. You can only distinguish it by monitoring the brain activity when a person has different motions. So this purple shaded area, that's the part of the brain that makes up the limbic system. That controls emotions like happiness, sadness, depression. What are some other emotions? Love, sense of peace. So that's all controlled by the limbic system. Limbic system also involves an important part of the brain that's involved in storage of long-term memory, and that's the hippocampus right here. The hippocampus was named because it looks kind of like a horse's tail. So that's this part right here. The amygdala right here is also involved in memories. The amygdala, since it's part of the limbic system, it's involved in emotions. The amygdala provides emotional overtones to memories. So it makes you feel happy when you think of certain things. And then we also looked at a functional brain, a functional model of the brain in lab before we left for Thanksgiving break. Some of the major areas of the brain include the primary motor cortex, which is this dark blue shaded gyrus. It's called the precentral gyrus. That's the part of the brain that controls voluntary motor activities of different parts of the body. And then right next to it, just posterior to the central sulcus. Central sulcus is this groove right between those two ridges. This is the postcentral gyrus, which is called the primary somatosensory cortex. That's the part of the cerebrum that interprets all of the somatic senses. General senses like from the skin, also interprets proprioception, which is the receptors in your joints and muscles and tendons. And then another important area is Broca's area right here, which is actually the more lateral and inferior part of the motor association area, or the prefrontal cortex. Broca's area is the part of the brain that controls speech, allows you to speak. So it does things like control the muscles that are involved in the functioning of your voice box, also your movements of your tongue and your cheeks that allow you to form words. And then this yellow shaded area is called Wernicke's area. That area is involved in language comprehension. So this area allows you to associate certain sounds with words. So it's one of the association areas of the brain. This orange area is an auditory association area. So that allows you to associate things like the sound of a person's name with their appearance. And then down here on the inferior part of the frontal lobe of the brain is the olfactory association area. That allows you to associate smells with certain types of foods or certain objects. So I plan on having at least one question on the quiz, which some of you will be taking tomorrow, some of you will be taking on Thursday. So I'll probably have one question on one of these functional regions of the brain, and I'll be using that functional model that was at one of the stations the week before Thanksgiving break. Okay, so this, you've seen this before. I showed this to you in lab. Over there on the right is a map of the primary motor cortex, and these body parts represent the areas of that gyrus that control muscles in those regions of the body. And the proportion of the body parts is proportional to the area of the postcentral gyrus that controls muscles in those regions. So you have a lot of ability. You have a lot of ability to control movements of your tongue. That's important because you don't want to bite your tongue accidentally when you're eating. Also, facial movements. You've got a lot of fine motor control of your eyes, and so it takes a larger part of the primary. I'm sorry. This is the primary somatosensory cortex, not the motor cortex. That's the next slide. So these are the regions that interpret sensory signals from all those areas. You have lots of sensory receptors in your face, and that's why it takes a lot larger area of that postcentral gyrus to interpret signals from the face. Sorry about that. I got those two mixed up. So this is the primary motor cortex then. Primary motor cortex is the gyrus just in front of the central sulcus, so that's called the precentral gyrus. So this is the ridge that controls the motor activities of the different body parts. And again, notice the face is also shown in a larger proportion than the rest of the body, and that's because you do have a lot of fine motor control over parts of your face, like your tongue and the muscles that move your eye, so you can track objects that are moving. That's important when you're doing things like driving, be able to predict where a car is going to be, a couple seconds later. That also involves the cerebellum. The cerebellum is involved in prediction of where moving objects are going to be located. Also, notice that the hand is a lot larger in proportion to like the trunk or the rest of the arm or the legs. And that's because you have a lot of sensory receptors in your fingertips, in your hands. And so that takes a larger part of the, you have a lot of fine motor, I'm sorry, I keep getting mixed up. You have a lot of fine motor control of your hands. So you can manipulate objects. And so you can do things like writing with pencil or pen. And so it takes a larger part of that primary motor cortex to control that part of the body. All right, let's do one more question, and then I think we might be getting close to the end of this section of chapter 14. So this question says, which of the following structures is not located in the diencephalon? So you can probably expect there'll be a lot of questions like this where I ask, where is a specific structure located in the brain? What major brain region? In fact, I think in my list of study questions, I have a set of matching questions that requires you to match a specific structure, like the pineal body, with the major brain region in which it's located. All right, let's take a look. Most of you said corpora quadrigemina, and that is correct. So what region is the corpora quadrigemina located in? It's in the midbrain, right? It's in the midbrain. Okay. So it's not located in the diencephalon. All those other structures are part of the diencephalon. Okay, here's another one. Where are the lateral ventricles located? Lateral ventricles, by the way, are also sometimes referred to as the first and second ventricles. I've never heard anybody define, though, which side is the first and which side is the second located on. They're just called the first and second ventricles collectively. Let's look at the results. Most of you said cerebrum, and again, that's correct. So, you know, I think it's helpful to have gone over this in lab and then go over it again in lecture, because the two reinforce each other. So I think it'll help you for the quiz in lab as well as our next exam, our final exam, which will cover chapter 14. All right. Next question. Stimulation of a part of the postcentral gyrus would cause what to happen? I kind of like this question because it requires you to associate the structural area with the functional region, and then answer the question. That allows you to answer the question. Quick here. Most of you said the number 2, and that's correct. Postcentral gyrus is the primary somatosensory area, so it's involved in interpretation of sensory stimuli. Okay, that's the end of this section, so we'll stop here. Have fun at the capstone presentations on Wednesday, and I'll see some of you tomorrow in lab. By the way, I'm going to go up to the lab probably during this next hour to prep out some of the brains for the quiz. If any of you want to go up there, if you're free, feel free to do so. We can go over some of the parts of the sheep brain.
Would it be possible that you open up the lab at 3 today?
3?
Yeah. I can email you again to remind you.
Yeah, I think I got to run home and let my dog out.
That's fine. You're fine.
At noon, but I will probably be I'll probably be back.
Yeah, and I can email you just to make sure.
Yeah, I can do that. Sure.
Okay, thank you.